Please, Jorun, you are muted.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Frode, for your very kind introduction. As Frode mentioned, I am a sociologist, and as you can see from my first slide here with that cartoon, I will take a critical approach to my topic today, which is to provide you with a sociological perspective on medicalisation. I'll focus on mental illness in particular, and I'll indicate some implications of care of these processes that involve medicalisation. I'll see if I can get my slide to change. Oh, this is not working. There we are. The title of the conference, as you know, is Primary and Long-Term Care in the Age of Changing Boundaries. I now got the message I haven't turned my video on. So I'm really sorry about this, people. I hope you can see me and hear me now, and see the title of the conference.
We could hear you, but suddenly you were muted again.
Yeah. Du är mutad, Jorun.
I'm sorry, this message is popping up on my screen saying that the organizers muted me, but can you hear me now?
Ja, man kan høre det. Jeg har ikke mutet deg.
Okay, I don't know what happened there. This message has popped up. Anyways, I'm really sorry. I'll start again, saying that what I will try to do is use the case of medicalisation as a way of thinking about how the boundaries of primary care might be changing. And the next 30 minutes, I will focus on what medicalisation is and what drives it. I'll look at some helpful and some problematic impacts of medicalisation, and how medicalisation in some respects broadens the health services remit, as in some cases quite a lot, and also some aspects of how we might see it setting services up to fail. I will focus particularly on mental health because that's my field of research, but I do think that the topics and issues that I will discuss are related to somatic care as well, but that mental health is a field where this kind of effects of medicalizations are particularly clear. And I will give you a word of warning. As a sociologist, I'm used to asking difficult questions, perhaps more than giving precise answers to them. But I do think that asking difficult questions can help us all to think about how we approach services and service development in the future. So what does medicalisation mean from a sociological point of view? Well, it means making medicine and the labels of healthy and ill relevant to an ever-increasing part of human existence. This was a definition from 1972 of one of the first researchers who started to study this within the field of sociology. More recently, Peter Conrad has defined it as what occurs when previously non-medical problems become defined and therefore treated as medical problems, usually as an illness or a disorder. And the concept was first and is still mostly used in medical sociology in studies of psychiatric practice, the way that what we've before called madness, now we call it an illness, and it is subject to medical treatment and control. And as you can see here, we've always had the village idiot or people that we've called crazy, mad, deviant, and those have been sort of labels we've used to make sense out of what is antisocial behavior, breaching social norms. Today, of course, we call these people ill, and we call the symptoms that they are suffering from as falling under diagnoses such as schizophrenia or other psychosis spectrum disorders. Similarly, in the wake of World War I, shell shock was a condition that plagued many soldiers. They could be called cowards, morally weak, deserters from the army, etc. Today, we would call them ill, suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And in this way, medicalisation, moving things into the health field, makes a problem understandable, controllable, and the person can receive health care. Now, as a sociologist, I'm particularly interested in these arrows. What is it, the process that moves something from one social field to another? And that's some of the issues I would like to explore now. And interest in this movement means that in sociology, we understand medicalization as a process, how the condition is moved into the health field or further into the health field if it is there already. And we study it in the same way as we study other kind of broad processes such as urbanization, globalization, secularization, and particularly individualisation, which we'll come back to several times in the next half hour. And ideally, we study it in conjunction with these other social processes. So it's not only about medicines and that you know we are treating more and more people with pills. It is that as well, but it's not only that. It is more about how we make sense of and try to solve or alleviate problems. And very often those problems are suffering and suffering in individual bodies. In sociology, we don't understand medicalization only as whether or not a condition is real or founded in biology. And it doesn't always imply over-medication or over-diagnostisation, although that is part of it. And finally, we don't approach it in a normative way. We don't say that it's right or wrong, but we sometimes raise the question, is this right? Is this wrong? And then we can, together with scholars from other fields, try to provide answers to that. We see medicalization in sociology as a dynamic phenomenon. And to some extent, we can see that medicalization can occur on a continuum from completely medicalized. I've here used the example of schizophrenia, for instance, and then to a smaller degree, just about moved into the health field. Maybe sex addiction can be an example of that, and ADHD might be somewhere in the middle. We also see medicalization as bidirectional. You can medicalize something and you can demedicalize something. The latter doesn't happen as often, but it has happened, such as homosexuality. Homosexuality, of course, was illegal before, then it was moved into the health sector and seen as a mental illness. Today, of course, we don't do that anymore. We see it as a completely normal set of activities and sexual orientations. Masturbation was previously seen as symptoms of mental illness. Today, we think it's normal, we think it's healthy. Medicalization and what has been medicalized can also show some elasticity. For instance, PTSD is today used in a much broader sense than before. Included in the diagnosis can be people who have been witnesses to violence, as well as people who have suffered violence themselves. Hysteria is almost gone. It has had a peak during the early of the last century, almost only applied to women, and it has gone in the same way as many other aspects of female lives have changed. Now, the drivers to this continuum elasticity by bidirectional movements and processes called medicalization are diverse, and they come from varying power bases and impact, and we'll return to that a little bit later. But first, what kind of things are being medicalized? Well, it can be things like normal life events, like childbirth. Most people give birth in a hospital today. It didn't happen 150 years ago. Menopause, hair loss, aging, all those things are things that we now try to treat sometimes with medication, and it has become relevant for the health field. We have already touched upon behavior that are in breach of social norms, that are seen as challenging or deviant. Gambling, drinking, weird sex, all kinds of things are being medicalized. Also, common problems like grief and shyness are being treated these days, and we'll come back to that in an example a little bit later. Social undesirable features like disabilities, obesity, acne, ugliness. I mean, the expansion of plastic surgery as a solution to people's problems is just really, really expanded over the last couple of decades. And we also medicalize risk. We treat moderately to high increased blood pressure, which isn't in itself an illness, it's a risk of illness. Same with cholesterol. And it seems like, as you can see on the cartoon on the right here, we really like to place people and their symptoms and experiences in boxes because it makes us understand it better. Some of these boxes might be a little bit weird. I didn't know what misphonia was until recently, but that is a condition in which negative emotions, thoughts, and physical reactions are triggered by specific sounds. And the sound of some people eating and making lots of noise when they eat is a common example. And as you can see here, it's actually an actual brain disorder. This girl is suffering from a syndrome. I'm not sure if anybody can guess what that is. It hasn't to do with her fingers and an electrical socket. In fact, she suffers from uncombable hair syndrome, a rare disorder of the hair shaft of the scalp. I could show you a long list of equally amusing and maybe not very sinister diagnoses and syndromes that have been sort of defined over the last decades. But I'll show you one much more sinister one and with more sinister intentions. And that's when psychiatric diagnoses are used as political tools. The case of sluggish schizophrenia, which is a kind of slow progressive schizophrenia, maybe a kind of pre-schizophrenia, that was only used in one place and in one time of the last century, and that was in the USSR from the 1960s onward until the end of the Soviet period. Hasn't really been used since then. Allegedly to this this article, it was instructed this diagnosis by the KGB, and handy enough, it was mostly applied to political dissidents whose prospects therefore were destroyed. I mean, if you had been diagnosed with this illness and treated in a hospital that was sort of initiated by the KGB, you can imagine that your future prospects were rather grim. But both uncombable hair syndrome and sluggish schizophrenia are really about defining a problem and what to do about them. And we have, of course, much more current issues that we struggle with. In Norway, there is a current debate about whether drug addiction belongs in the legal system or in the health system. And this is quite consequential, because it means, should we treat drug addicts as criminals or as patients? Should we punish them? Should we decriminalize the activity of taking and buying drugs? Or should we give them entitlements to care? And there are many different views on this one. This is a newspaper article written by a very known figure in public health in Norway, who calls the way that the police are treating drug addicts in Oslo abuse of patients. By using the word patient, he makes his position clear that these people should be treated in healthcare, and drug addiction should be moved into that field. You have other organizations who clearly state that no, we should not decriminalize drug use. It belongs in the legal system. So that we are not always in agreement about how we should solve problems, but an increasing number of problems are defined to belong to the health field, and they are being treated. Prediabetes, subclinical hypothyroidism, I take a pill for that every morning. Infertility, road rage, Facebook addiction, food intolerances, too narrow lips, too wide hips. There is no end to the kind of problems that we today seek to solve through the healthcare system. And that raises the question about whether we should use our common resources in the health field in this way. How should we use them? It's a huge question. And before we try to answer that, I think we need to look at some of the positive effects of medicalisation as well as some of the problematic ones. And there are, of course, a lot of good things about moving problems, moving suffering into the health field. Some obvious ones could be how people suffering from epilepsy before were rejected by society were seen as really deviant and quite dangerous ones. Now we know that they have a disorder, an illness that can be treated. Rejection has reduced quite a lot. We can say the same about not other mental illnesses. We can say the same about mental illnesses, that there is less stigmatization. And I think that might be the case for depression and anxiety and some of the milder mental illnesses. I'm not too sure if it applies to schizophrenia and psychosis, but I think we are on the way. Of course, if you treat people and don't punish them, we can see that there is a more humane social control at play. and also that medicalization can make what seems irrational, scary, dangerous, or just really, really difficult to comprehend more understandable. And that can give hope. The quote at the bottom of my page here is from a family carer that I interviewed. Her son had recently been diagnosed with schizophrenia after many, many years of quite problematic situations for the family. And she said, I didn't realize this was an illness. And that was the last thing I had in my mind. It was hugely relieving to her that there was an illness. It could give hope because it provided entitlement to healthcare. And of course, it is obvious, but most medicines and other treatments make people better, or it can prevent them from getting ill. So there's a lot to say for medicalizing many of the problems and suffering that people experience. But there are problematic effects of medicalization as well. And as a sociologist, I feel it's my duty to particularly highlight those. We might be running the risk of pathologizing everything. I mean, we have more than 300 psychiatric diagnoses now: gambling, hoarding, erectile dysfunction, and a wide range of dependencies are now sort of treated as psychiatric disorders. Funnily enough, nicotine addiction is not among the dependencies that are listed in the manuals, at least not yet. And this isn't only the case within the mental health field, it also relates to somatic care. And we know that we then run the risk of over-testing, over-diagnosing, and over-medicating patients. This puts pressure on services, both in terms of time and resources, but it also exposes thousands of people to side effects. I mean, there are movements or developments to sort of lower the bar for treating blood pressure from 140 systolic to 120. That would mean millions or more people would be exposed to the side effects of those medicines. Some of the medicalization can also undermine natural psychological reactions, such as grieving. I mean, we all grieve when we lose somebody. All mammals, in fact, grieve. And if we are to follow recent guidelines to diagnose people with sort of severe grief of more than 2 months as ill, then probably half of us would be diagnosed with that after losing somebody that we love. So it in a way, it can undermine some of our natural psychological reactions. And medical norms and control then replaces social ones. And we run the risk of individualization of social problems. This can prevent focus on complexity, such as health inequality. If we only look at individual bodies, maybe we lose track on some of the underlying social dimensions to this. As Zola said as early as 1972, medicalization depoliticizes issues, closing off other interventions. So what is it that drives this then, this medicalization that has some positive but also some problematic dimensions to it? Well, the traditional answer is that it's the medical profession's fight for position and hegemony. I think that might be part of the story, but I think it's way too simplistic. There are many, many more driving forces that are at least as strong, technological innovation being one of them. For instance, since IVF was invented, infertility has increasingly been medicalized. And today in many societies, if you are infertile, you have the right to have IVF treatment in a public health system. Big pharma and the drive for profit is a huge driver for medicalization, but also the way that we organize our health and social care system, because diagnoses really are the currency of those systems now. If I'm ill for a long period of time and I need a sick leave, my doctor needs to put a diagnosis on that. In systems that are insurance driven, the insurer need a diagnosis before they can release funds for medical appointments or medical treatment. And of course, this also means that consumers sometimes demand diagnosis and treatment. And I'm sure those of you who are doctors are used to people like me coming into your offices saying, look, I've been Googling, I know what's wrong with me. Please, can you diagnose me with this and provide me with the treatment that I want? And patient groups and activists can sort of gang up and lobby for medicalizing certain issues and maybe demedicalizing others. And then public discourse, social media, mainstream media are also drivers in this regard. And very often these drivers occur in conjunction with each other and are interconnected. And I'll give you one example of that, which is social anxiety disorder, which was deemed the disorder of the decade in the 1990s. Social anxiety disorder is really the intense and enduring fear of social situations or situations where one might be negatively evaluated by others and the embarrassment that this can entail. And the sociologist Peter Conrad has said, why did shyness, a normal personality trait, become increasingly pathologized and subject to medical intervention? And he looked into this and found a wide range of drivers that happened in conjunction. First of all, within medicine, social anxiety disorder was defined as a diagnosis as early as the 1980s, but it was not really used much. So it was sort of sitting there idle in the manual. Then something happened within big pharma. In the early 90s, there was a fierce SSRI market, that is antidepressant market. Many players were in the field wanting to sell their pills. GlaxoSmithKline came a little bit late to the game, and they decided that they would apply for the approval for their SSRI against social anxiety disorder, this disorder that wasn't really diagnosed very much. And they then launched a massive PR campaign, and that was possible because of something that happened in the law. It became legal to advertise medication and branded medication directly to the consumer. That they didn't have to go through the psychiatrist anymore. They could go directly to the consumer. So they launched this massive PR campaign that first defined social anxiety disorder as a problem, and then they launched Paxil as the only approved medication. And this is one of their advertisements saying, has social anxiety put your life on hold? And they have very helpfully ticked the yes box here, it's indicating that you should talk to your doctor about it. You are not alone. They have a little questionnaire you can fill in to show that, yes, you have this disorder and you need treatment. And then they recommend, ask your doctor about Paxil today. Your life is waiting. So medicine, big pharma, law, you had drivers there, but of course, consumers wanted this. They saw, I've been struggling with this because social anxiety is quite difficult to live with. People really suffer from it, and it's hard to try to go it on your own. So many wanted this diagnosis, and they wanted a medication that could help them. Newsweek called this approach psychopharmacological plastic surgery. But of course, none of this would have happened had it not been without a wide cultural acceptance. And Peter Conrad sees this as aligning with more general processes of individualization, in which we have a personal responsibility for our health and our happiness. And he suggests maybe this has to do also with secularization and other processes. And I think there is some truth to this cartoon on the right here, that we need to fix ourselves, and it's easier to line up for toxic pills and surgery. And this poor fella in the booth to the right, who sells lifestyle changes, hasn't got that much traffic. So let's think more about this issue of medicalisation and individualisation, and this is really my key message today. This model of social determinants of health is old. It's from 1991 by Dahlgren and Whitehead, but I think we can learn a lot from that. In the middle, you have us, our individual bodies, and of course our health is closely related to our age, our sex, our genes, our inheritance, etc. But around that, you first have the individual lifestyle factors that impact and influence our health. They are again influenced by social and community networks, our living and working conditions, unemployment, water and sanitation, healthcare services, housing, work environment, education, food, impact on all of this. And we have general socioeconomic, cultural, and environmental conditions, all impacting on each other and on our health. And the problem then is if medicalisation places the causes and the solutions to these complex social problems in individual bodies and not in the systems that produce them, or at least produced some of them. And we then aim to change or to treat individuals and not the systems. And maybe we have less focus on prevention, and the treatment going straight into individual bodies might miss the target. If you, of course, you can see that if you, for instance, suffer from salmonella, then you have to treat the patient, but you should also really ought to do something about the chicken factory. And when we look at many of these illnesses or syndromes or conditions that we talked about, they are complex and they have social dimensions to them as well. Social anxiety is obviously how that has a social dimension to it. HGAD we haven't spoken that much about, but it's a classical example in medical sociology of maybe medicalisation and over-medicalisation. Grief we have talked about. Psychosis is commonly understood as having both individual gene contributions, but all these pressures that come from life are really triggers as well. Oops, that was a little bit too fast. So we really need to ought to think about how we, as a result of thinking more in medical terms and moving things into the health field, maybe we run the risk of missing some of the drivers, some of the social determinants of health. And one particularly problematic area that I have been researching quite a lot is the effect of individualization on severe mental disorder. And we quite often see public outcries, like these ones from the English newspapers. Get the violent crazies off our streets. 1,200 people killed by mental health patients. Shock 10-year tolls exposes care crisis. Because when we have moved all these problems into the health system, it is their responsibilities. And its tools are medical, and they very often lack options in crisis. And we end up trying to solve quite complex problems by enforcing medication into individual bodies, or in other ways, trying to control individual bodies to alleviate a problem. This, of course, has effects and anti sort of protestation. And we see a lot of activists campaigning for the demedicalisation of certainly of some of the psychiatric diagnoses. Service user organizations protest against what they see as overly medicalised mental health care systems. They want treatment to be more than medication, so they don't want the diagnosis to be moved completely out of the health field, but to move somewhat on the continuum that we saw earlier and focus more on recovery, which means to live and get support to live with your symptoms and lead meaningful lives, having your social needs met. The medical control through involuntary medication is seen as highly problematic, and there is demand for user involvement and control. And of course, this is not something particular to the mental health field. This is part of a wider movement for democratization in healthcare. And we see that power dynamics change over time, and we see very often that the medical professions are at the forefront pushing for that, with shared decision-making and more patient involvement in care and in the organization of care as well. So in summary, medicalisation is about the current tendency of moving more and more stuff, responsibilities and control into the health field. This has both positive and problematic dimensions. It can improve health and reduce stigma. It can give healthcare entitlements, but it also means that health services must deal with everything, and that very complex issues are placed in individual bodies. The drivers are diverse with different agenda and power bases, as we have seen. I think we should stop just one moment. I've been very critical, but most of it is driven by desires to help. But we really need to ask ourselves some big questions, and these were the ones I promised you earlier that I'm not going to answer, but I hope that we can together try and think about them. Is this sort of wholesale movement into the health field, is that what we want as a society? How is it changing the boundaries of primary care? Is it sustainable? And what should we prioritize when we're faced with all of this? And maybe we see that it isn't quite sustainable. Now I'll end on a happy note. I told you earlier that nicotine addiction has not yet been medicalized. If it is, help is at hand, because you can talk to your doctor a day about how Paxil can give you the confidence to quit smoking once and for all. On that note, I will leave you and thank you very much for your attention.